Before we start, I just wanted to acknowledge that the land that we're standing on and that we live and inhabit today was the land of the Huron, Wendat, the Seneca, as well as more recently the Mississauga of the Credit River. And I would like to acknowledge the land personally, but also on behalf of all of us at the Art Museum, which is part of this evening's event in a number of ways. Before we get started and before I introduce Henry and Henry introducing Ken, I just wanted to note that this coming week, the Art Museum will be hosting the Sobi Arts Awards that you may have already heard about. The opening is on Tuesday at 6 p.m. and it's a public opening. It would be great to welcome you there. It is open to everyone. There will be a panel discussion with the 5 shortlisted artists who are currently representing Canada, in effect, a kind of overview of the country from British Columbia to the west, the central regions, Quebec and Nova Scotia. And the panel discussion will be moderated and everyone is welcome, but you need to reserve. There will be a curatorial tour by Sarah Robayo Sheridan and a performance by Bridget Moser, the Toronto artist who is represented amongst the 5 shortlisted artists, on Saturday at 2 o'clock and at 3 o'clock respectively. Again, the events are open and free. And as part of the evening's introduction, I also wanted to mention that there are 2 recent graduates of the Masters of Visual Studies program who have currently projects at the university. Darren Dool, as an internship, did an exhibition at the Jackman Humanities Institute. If you haven't seen it, it's called Morning Star. It's open to publics from 9 to 5 every day. It's a really wonderful project done as an internship for the Curatorial Studies degree. And Yan Wu, a recent graduate, produced an outdoor project, our first on-site, off-site project by the Art Museum in the courtyard at the Sir Daniel Wilson Quad, which is close to University College, an installation by Toronto architects UFI. And it's a really wonderful piece to see outdoors, and especially with this kind of amazing weather. And without much further ado, I would like to introduce Henry Lu, who is the most recent graduate from the Masters of Visual Studies program. His exhibition is at the Justina Barnicke Gallery. He will mention and talk about it briefly. And he is introducing the speaker tonight because his exhibition tackles questions that have been very much a part of Ken Lum's work over many years. But the exhibition is a kind of historical examination of the Chinese diaspora in Toronto and in Canada. So it's at the Justina Barnicke Gallery in Hart House. It would be great to see you there as well. And so welcome, Henry, for making this possible, this evening's talk.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for coming tonight to Ken Lum's lecture. My name is Henry Heng Lu. I would like to introduce, thanks, Barbara, for the introduction. I would like to introduce you, Ken Lum. Vancouver-born artist Ken Lum is internationally renowned for his conceptually oriented representational art practice across media, including painting, sculpture, and photography. A longtime professor, he currently is the chair of fine arts at the University of Pennsylvania's School of Design in Philadelphia. He was formerly professor of art at the University of British Columbia, Vancouver, Bard College, Annandale-on-Hudson, New York, and the School of Fine Arts, Paris. Practicing as an artist for over 30 years, he has been included in such major exhibitions such as Documenta 11, the Venice Biennale, Sao Paulo Biennial, Shanghai Biennale, Carnegie Triennial, Sydney Biennial, Busan Biennial, Liverpool Biennial, Guangzhou Biennale, Moscow Biennial, and Whitney Biennial, among many others. So that's Ken. Please give a round of applause for Ken. Here. Thanks so much. And I would like to talk just a little bit about the exhibition before I introduce you to Ken. So Ken's work titled Language Painting from 1987 is part of the exhibition that I curated, titled Far and Near, The Distances Between Us. 那么远又那么近，我们之间的距离, which is on view at the Art Museum at U of T, Justina M Barnicke Gallery, until October 29, which is next Sunday. So the exhibition presents 11 artists of the Chinese diaspora in Canada who examine histories and subject positions in a complex present. And through a lineup of public programming events, I would like to extend the conversations about the subject beyond the gallery space. And tonight's lecture is a co-presentation with NVS Proseminar series. It's part of the exhibition's public programming series. And before I go, I would like to sort of advertise. There is a curatorial tour this Saturday at 2 p.m. at Justina M Barnicke Gallery of the exhibition. So I think that's it. And please welcome Ken Lum.
Wow, it's great to be in Toronto. It's amazing what it's like to come to a highly capitalized city. Philadelphia is quite a poor city, right? So it's kind of night and day in many respects. Despite the the slogan, identity politics is dead, long live identity politics, and the kind of pithy abstract below it, which I was demanded of me to write something. The talk itself will be probably more like a conventional artist talk where I show images and talk about the work, but I will reframe it in a way that I normally don't do. I will, for once, maybe talk more about biography in terms of what role that plays in terms of development of my work. I think usually I have a kind of a framework in terms of biography, but I'll try to delve even more deeply into it. Then you can psychoanalyze it after the talk and so on. I grew up in Vancouver. In many respects, I don't feel like I should even be here because I grew up basically a single mother. The father disappeared for almost decades on end, and my mother was a sweatshop worker, and she died quite when I was in my early 20s because of benzene poisoning from working in a sweatshop, as did 5 or 6 other of her closest friends. They all died of leukemia from benzene. I told you it's not going to be one conventional type talk. And I say that because I feel that I, in many ways, embodied the debates in terms of multiculturalism, identity politics, in a way that was street level, let's say, as opposed to something that I kind of learned or academically took in. And so, but I always had facility to draw and to model make with my hands, particularly with clay, because I was lucky enough to live not far away from a man named Albert Stubbs, who was a graduate of the Royal Academy in sculpture, and he was a stevedore at the time, and liked to drink, and but somehow ended up a divorcee in the poorest section of Vancouver, making ends meet on his own. But he taught me how to do clay modeling and things like that. And he was also a part-time sign painter, and I learned a lot about. I was his assistant, and this is when I was only probably 8 to about 12 years old, and then he passed away. Right, so I did, and then afterwards, throughout high school, I was an illustrator for the BC government, Ministry of Agriculture. I did hundreds of flora and fauna ink drawings for the government. So that if most of you are too young, but if you are old enough, and you probably don't remember, but if my drawings were always on every BC Ferries trip between Vancouver Island and Vancouver, it would just be like, the black bear. Did you know the black bear? And the drawings were mine, and sometimes it would be, Agrolimax maximus, the great slug, and things like that, right? Or Agrolimax columbianus, or even trees like Camecitrus nucatensis. You see how traumatic it's been? Because I actually, it's like flowing. It's like a stream of consciousness. I remember these terrible Latin names, right? Hymenoptera splangea endius was like a little wasp. You see, I could just keep going. It's like this well. And I fear that when I'm finally on my deathbed, I'm just going to say Hymenoptera splangea endius or something like that. But anyway, so I feel like I was unlucky in a way in terms of, but I also remember learning a lot about the real politic of the world. And this is not a sob story at all. I've written about this for an essay for MIT Press on the future of the art school, because I think the art world, the way it's defined by capital and entertainment and so on, often excludes a lot of really potentially interesting voices. I mean, I think I celebrate the proliferation of biennials that took place, especially after the start of the early 90s, because it really allowed for new voices of alterity to reinvigorate the system of art, the discourse of art. And I remember when I was about 6 or 7. By the way, when I was 6 and I went into grade 1, I didn't go to kindergarten. I didn't speak a word of English. It was completely traumatic, right, to me. That's how kind of much of an enclave to the edge of Chinatown was. I only spoke Cantonese. I didn't speak a word of English, and I went to school, and I remember it was just hellish. It was like these people trying to talk to me. I don't know if you've ever seen John Frankenheimer's Seconds, that movie. Maybe some of you have seen it. It's like these heads are just looking at me like, what, do you not understand anything? And so on, and so on. And so that formation, I remember, really having much of an effect on me. But then I was lucky because we moved, and there's a neighbor named Pearl Gould, and who's actually a distant cousin of Glenn Gould, and she came over to and said, Jane, my mother, said, Jane, you're always working so hard, so many hours, and I see the kids there, and they're just, they walk home, and they're there with my grandfather, and so on. And then she said, I used to be a teacher, just, and my mother didn't speak a word of English. I had to work through a translator and so on. And so, so we spent after schools with her, and I was lucky, and I learned English. And I spoke some English by the time of grade 3, but I really hungered for knowledge after this experience with Pearl Gould. So I felt really lucky, and I always think about kids who weren't so lucky, and so on. And I think that's a kind of something to bear in mind all the time, right? Always think about, always be curious about someone else, always be interested about someone else, but always, if I see someone walking down the street like this, I'll go, wow, probably at that job forced that person to walk that way. I do this all the time, every day, and I think it's actually a good thing. I tell my son to think about things like that as well. So when I enter into art, this is kind of an accident because I have an undergraduate degree in chemistry, and I was going to go into a Master of Science degree at Simon Fraser. And then what happened was I kind of discovered this art class purely by accident. It was actually Simon Fraser at that time had a lot of programs that counted for credit, but they also counted as for mature students, and so they had an evening course, and I was always interested in art, and so I took it. It was actually taught by Jeff Wall, and then the second time I took it was actually Ian Wallace, and I was actually quite shocked in terms of what passed as art, because all my new colleagues whom I liked couldn't draw, right? They couldn't draw a horse, and I would say, I can draw a horse. What makes you think you should be taking art, right? And so on. I mean, I'm wrong. I understand that, but at the time I had this framework in terms of understanding what art, how art was constituted, right? And so I rebelled. I even hated the class, but I was also deep on a deeper level, incredibly intrigued by art, right? And so on. And oddly enough, I gravitated immediately into video and performance and so on. And shortly after that, I met Kim at Pumps Gallery, right? So we go back Kim Tomczak, we go back a long way. But I remember being kind of fascinated, but also slightly hostile, like this cannot be art, but also, and I couldn't get my head around that contradiction for a while. So, but then I don't know, something just kind of made sense to me because I realized there's a lot of people who could draw and they're really not good artists. I mean, because they have nothing to say, and I realized that's really the difference, and so on. And so when this is from 1978, and I was still a student, and I was learning about art. I was learning about avant-garde movements, for example, obviously minimal art. And I was kind of interested in the, the kind of pathology of minimal art, this idea of, always kind of claiming a kind of phenomenological essence or some search for some essence of form or structure that couldn't even be named. That's why it's just minimal art. And that it had no relationality, as Judd said. It had no relationality, certainly no hierarchy, and that was a testament to its Americanness as opposed to its European qualities. And I remember being kind of fascinated by that because I thought, wow, that's quite nihilistic. Like European art by and large isn't nihilistic. It may be existential, but even existentialism still has at its core some human person or some idea of a subject formation in the face of a nihilistic environment, right? But American art has its own kind of teleology, right? That can be quite formal, right, and abstract in a very absolute sense, and so on. And so I was fascinated by this language of minimal art and somehow inverting it to reveal its kind of repressed social character by using furniture, right? Because furniture is aligned to the privacy of an interior home, and minimal art was, if nothing, a very private, hermetic language that coincided with the parameters, the architectural parameters of the abstract cubistic space, and so on. So this is the sort of stuff I was doing, and then it kind of developed. This is my studio, and I'd rent out furniture and so on. And actually, I don't normally say this anecdote, but I'm going to in this context. A few years ago, I gave a talk in a major art school in the United States. I won't mention it for fear you might locate the person who made the comment to me. But quite a well-known curator, a very well-known curator, in fact. And I mentioned about how I picked the furniture because I thought it would be furniture that my mother would really like, and people laughed, right? But honest to God, she would have really liked it. This would be a step up, right? And then at dinner afterwards, the famous curator who goes unnamed, who's still a friend of mine, by the way, said to me, "I don't believe you," right? And I said, what don't you believe? And he says, "I don't believe that when you say that your mother would have liked it, it was clearly very ugly." Right? And I remember thinking, I was quite shocked by that. And that kind of, I don't want to generalize that as the truth of the art world, but there is the art world has certain demographic, let's say, that it tends towards. And so I went, wow, it was like, I was just shocked by that because I said, I don't know how to respond to that other than that it would have been something my mother, obviously you can't fathom it, right? It was great. But it was also very real, like the Lacanian capital R real. It was like something very penetrating and painful when he said that. Because it was like this it's almost like this Hegelian non-identity was so extreme at that point. And so, I went on to do various permutations of furniture, and I got these from basically like a Sally Ann store, really ratty. There was actually a mice in it, and then I just reupholstered, not reupholstered, what do you call it, whatever that is, just the very bottom with some cheap black cloth. And this is actually in a well-known Chicago collector's home, and I was actually invited to dinner at his place once, and it was right behind me. It was just the weirdest feeling. I'd turn around, and I'd be eating the canapes. I'd turn around, there'd be these, it's just very strange. Of course, you had these kind of very expensive Roche-Beaubois type furniture, and so on, and this would be in the corner. Yeah. But I think I'm interested in this idea that, you know, these are like figures, the figure in the corner, you know, the person that's told to go to the corner, or something, right? This kind of presence, this insertion of this presence of embodied alterity within, obviously in that case, an old bourgeois collector's home. And I would make these sorts of works, and now it's amazing how many people kind of like, we should make more of these pieces. But when I was making it at that time, in the early part of the to the late 80s, a lot of people, particularly in Canada, was quite hostile to it. I would say they thought it was cold. They thought it was too American looking. It was whatever that meant. They thought it was too you know, didn't allow the subject of the subjects to, you know, issue out, and so on. It was too contained within the systems of naming or representation, systems of studio photography, systems of signs, commercial signage, and so on. And I even had a curator from, quite a well-known curator in Canada, who said to me, you know, your work is so cold, and you know, it's not Canadian to have such cold art, and which I thought was very prescriptive, and I was quite offended by it. And so I was more testy when I was younger. I've kind of mellowed now, right? And I said, why is that, right? And no, because I didn't feel I was being hostile to this person. I was just replying in a more firm way, like, why would you think that, right? And the person, see, I'm being very neutral in terms of gender here as well. And the person who's a famous curator in Canada said, well, if you don't know what, you know, the project Canadian art is, you know, I'm not going to teach you that. I mean, it was really quite amazing, right? It was actually a kind of, and I encountered that quite often, I have to say, during that whole period, and so on. And so this is Cecil and Ethel Grote. And these are plexiglass, right? Done on plexiglass. It's fairly big, not as big as this, obviously. And so they're parents of a friend of mine, actually, lived in the suburbs of Vancouver in Burnaby. Right, and I got a lot of flack. You know, you're dehumanizing them, and so on, right? And but I don't think you know, I don't think the role of art is to simply extol the humanity in each of us. I think you know, I see the project of art as embodying and projecting and expressing the tensions in terms of subject formation that constitutes the society we have. I think that's a more interesting project, right? But it was very hard to persuade I would say, a significant number of brokers of power in the Canadian art world at that time. You're taking notes, I hope, Mark Cheatham? Okay, good, okay. And so Jansen family, not Jansen Sumar, it's just, that is the Jansen family. Right. So, but I also saw it somewhat in ironic terms. I was personalizing, ascribing a logotype to this family, who's, you know, and it's using the same logic as, you know, Dow Computer, Getty Oil, what other companies with big names and so on, and such. Rogers Media. And at that time, I think, I look back now, but at that time, I think, especially in a Canadian context, it was quite shocking in a way. Maybe I'm giving to myself too much credit. So correct me, those who were there at the time. But you know, it was like, wow, wait a second, this is really, you know, you want to go to New York, then show this in New York. Don't show this in Canada. I got a lot of that, you know. I still have the very I would say, quite ad hominem critiques, would say, at that time. Like, I felt like I was constantly being told to be in my place. So I'm Rita and Mrs. Sandhi, and you know, that's Mr. Sandhi there, represented by his name. Miss Vancouver. This is just a selection. I've made hundreds of works. And the works, you know, developed, right? Because, you know, at some point I found it too constraining to just limit the work to a kind of logo type and a depicted person. And so I wanted to use the same kind of a, you know, system of graphics, right? Which I had a kind of theory of graphics and so on, and captioning using the same kind of logic, but as a kind of attribution of the depicted person. So you know, as a kind of attribution of Alex's interiority, for example, to try to create some sort of equilibrious oscillation between the two parts. But, you know, it's also like a double portrait, because the text component projects many, many different pictures of Alex Gonzalez, whereas the picture itself can also produce many, many textual captions, right? So that's the kind of oscillation, because they're never fully identified one to the other. And I was interested in this kind of oscillation. And the works got bigger. They were done on metal with aluminum car paint. I had you know, basically sign companies fabricate them. The picture's completely mise en scène. You know, I constructed the picture. I designed the pig outfit. I had a seamstress make the pig outfit. Pepe's Pizza does not exist. You know, things like that. So I took this picture, and then I looked for, I would interchange the models and so on. And I thought, oh yeah, you know, there's this kind of this biracial child, and whom I met, and I thought she'd be perfect in the picture, but I didn't know she was biracial. And then I saw, and I just liked this idea of, you know, of not for provocative reasons. Just for complicating the pictorial space. I should say, I should say an anecdote related to this, which was the idea for it actually came out when I was actually having coffee at some Vancouver coffee bar, and as I was sitting there, it was a nice warm summer day, and I looked down to my right, and I see the A&W root bear coming down the street, handing out coupons, right, and so on. And then the root bear comes just near in front of me, and at that point, a little girl, similar in age to this girl, but looked like Goldilocks, came out and grabbed the root bear by the leg, looked up and said, "I love you, A&W root bear," right? And I remember I just about kvetched, right, because I thought, oh, this is horrifying scene, you know, because, you know, I don't mind. I like to think that she was endeared by the bear, not A&W, right? But it becomes very confused there, and that's why I wanted to make this piece. Come On, Get Up. It's a really big piece, and I guess I did this in response to like the Reagan era. Come on, get up. You know, you're poor because you didn't get up, and so on, right? And but it's kind of like a neoclassical depth scene, and so on. Yeah, I did this like 1989, I think, or 1990. Nancy Nishi, Zhoping Chow Real Estate, about Asians moving into Vancouver and kind of buying up real estate very early on, and so on. And obviously, it's, you know, it's similarly in Toronto, it's become a kind of a kind of an issue, right? But I wasn't so interested in that issue so much as the kind of irony of Chinese identity or Asian identity, because I was more interested in how, you know, these Asians from, how Asians, I was interested in the history of legations, let's say, the history of legations by foreign powers in China, right? And earlier in Japan, where you had European powers basically through gunboat diplomacy open up Japan, the economy of Japan, because the West couldn't get enough of Japanese goods and then later on Chinese goods, and that heralded the Meiji dynasty, Meiji regime in Japan, but also heralded the end of the Qing dynasty, basically, in China, and then how there was a kind of seizure in terms of Hong Kong, obviously, and how a kind of mercantile system was put into place in Hong Kong, and how you know, diasporic Asians kind of fomented entrepreneurial skills that 100 years, and went to these English schools, right, in Hong Kong and Singapore and so on. And then 100 years later, kind of expresses their talents in terms of being capitalists in Vancouver, right, in British Columbia, which at that time was still like, you know, we are British Columbia, we're not, and so on. You had this kind of old guard population, you know, from Kerrisdale and the West Side, Dunbar, and all these Shaughnessy and all these British properties, all these areas of old, like not just old, but kind of like this expat, English expat population, right? And I was more interested in that circle, that kind of historical circle, than anything else. I'm not going to talk about every image because I want to get through this, and because I'm actually looking forward to Q&A. So, Woodcutter's Wife, it's obviously about BC. This actually came about because I used to work as a hamburger flipper when I was a teenager at happily demised burger chain called Burger Chef. It was a god-awful place, right? And he made McDonald's seem like haute cuisine. It's just god-awful stuff. But anyways, every month there was an employee of the month. And I remember years later, right, I was with a friend, and we went into Denny's for breakfast, right? And there's an employee of the month at the entrance. And my friend, who's an artist, again unnamed, okay, said, oh, this is so ridiculous. I said, what's so ridiculous? You know, come on. Working at Denny wants employee of the month, right? I said, what are you talking about? I said, if you were working at Denny's, you would want to be employee of the month too. And he was just shocked I would say that. I said, I'm serious. If you're working at Denny's, you would want to be employee of the month. And he said, oh, come on, I would not. I said, you would. Right? So we had this standoff, right? Because I remember I wanted to be employee of the month at Burger Chef, right? Even though the job was shit, right? So that's what I was interested in. I was interested in that. I'm not interested in the question of, you know, from a loftier position. There's no bloody way that person would ever want to be employee of the month. Okay? If you had to work in some shit job and they had an opportunity to recognize you, you'd want to be employee of the month. I guarantee you. And I did a lot of kind of sign paintings on the side, but I also incorporated it into my art. You can see I work in different veins of art, often dealing with language or the idea of the limits of language, let's say, such as here, gibberish. And I always start with a drawing. I do a drawing for pretty well everything before I proceed. And sometimes incorporate one or the other with the other. And And then I developed in the middle part of the 90s another vein of work involving mirrors, because identity, the mirror is such a great metaphor of a subject, right? Because it's kind of it's Lacanian for one thing, this idea of self-knowledge through the mirror in terms of your own childhood development, but also how it's really the kind of the kind of imminent imminent example, right, for la lumière, right, the kind of enlightenment, right, the idea of the kind of rational, contained, beautifully and perfectly defined individual, right, whose quest of self-knowledge can be rationally perfected, right, this idea of the Enlightenment. And the mirror was like this kind of quintessential symbol of this, right? But of course, the mirror is not you, right? That's the kind of Lacanian idea, is that it's not you. It creates actually a kind of a trauma, because there's a dissonance between you and your reflection, and so on, right? And it also becomes a kind of in a sublimated form, a kind of exemplar of the notions of desire and the incompletion of ever knowing, reaching and negotiating fully your desires and so on. So I was kind of interested in this, and I collected just randomly just personal pictures from people. It was amazing. I asked people for personal pictures, and they kept giving it to me. And then I would just kind of curate a set of pictures. None of the pictures come from a single household or an individual, but once they become thoughtfully arranged within this specially designed mirror where you can actually pin it in along the edges, they take on a kind of unity, because of the mirror says the mirror is the field, and these along the periphery of the frame is the story, is the kind of narrative of whomever, the kind of panoply of experiences that have aggregated here. And now I have a relationship to this narrative of this other person or persons or household or whatever, right? Except these are not your memories, and as I said, these are not from a univocal source anyway, right? So I was, again, interested in this kind of confusion in terms of that, the kind of circularity. I'm interested in like motion in terms of the idea of subject constitutions and so on, and going from from one picture to another, back to the mirror and so on. Plus, of course, when you stand in front of the mirror, there's other mirrors in the space, and you actually see other people looking. So it's very recursive, right? It's very recursive in the sense that it's about reflection, right? And not only that, you actually see yourself looking, right? If you turned your head, you might see yourself standing, looking in front of another work. And I kind of like this idea of intermingling of all this constellation of subjects, right, that make up the viewership of this gallery show, for example. Then I moved into more signs, but using kind of provisional, the logic of provisional lettering. And these companies do not exist, but they can exist plausibly, right? So it's not like they don't exist, they just don't exist de facto, but they can plausibly exist. And I was interested again in this kind of dissonance, oscillation, whatever, difference between the textual part that's more provisional and then the more permanent, facade that projects, this is our business, this is the information you need to know in terms of bread. And here you have, obviously, Shirley Janich aligned to Shirley's Bakery, the name eponymous Shirley's Bakery, and she died. I bet you a lot of people don't know who Leonard Peltier is, eh? No. Still in jail. American Indian movement, he should not be in jail, but he's still in jail. And, well, you're going to have to look him up, Leonard Peltier. It's shameful that he's still in jail. Right? So I use this as a kind of vehicle for a kind of activation in terms of, political thought. I don't think of myself as an activist. At Penn where I work, there was like these curators from paper monuments in New Orleans, and they were like real hard-nosed activists. And I sympathized with activism, but I'm an artist, and that's not a cop-out. I'm an artist. I'm interested in the activation of space, production of space, of dialogue in a public sense, of expanding and complicating what comprises the public space, or public space in general. And I see that as a kind of activism, but what I do is also not activism in the sense that it's directly agitational. Grace just gave terrible advice to her investors. No, I'm just kidding. And obviously, there's in many of the maybe there's some humor, but it's not just humor; it's a humor noir. It's a kind of black comedy, because I think black comedy always makes you feel some pit, makes you feel the pit of your stomach, and I'm interested in that. Right, and so I think the subjectivity of this proprietor of Taj Kebab Palace is, you glean something of his subjectivity here. Maybe he comes from the north of India, and he worries. And I kept developing these kind of mirror pieces. These are like diptych pieces that maybe you can't see, but if you fill in the gap here, it's a perfect square. It would be about 8.5 feet by 8.5 feet. Right? This distance here to here matches the vertical. And the idea, and I was thinking about how when people speak to themselves, and maybe not everyone speaks to themselves, but I always speak to myself, and I always, and usually it's in the morning when I get up, and I'm looking at myself in the mirror, and I was interested in this kind of moment where you actually, it's not like a crystalline singular moment where you say, "Oh God, I can't believe I did that last night," or whatever. But it's actually, you can actually break it up somehow. So I was interested in that moment, and so the ideal viewing position is the point in between this diptych, which are always colored around the frames, and so. The first one here, maybe you can't see it, says, "I must be losing my mind," is the first one on the left. And then on the right, it says, "Am I really losing my mind?" Right? So I was kind of interested in this kind of compressed moment where the thought isn't quite formulated, but it's comprised of kind of variations of text, of language, and so on. So here it is, what the hell did you do that for? What the hell were you thinking? Right? So you're standing there, and when you're standing here at the ideal viewing position, you actually don't see yourself. Right? So literally, if you're 3 feet in front and you're standing 3 feet right where the gap is, you do not see yourself. So you actually disappear, and that's the best position to actually take in both texts at the same time. So they kind of look like this. And Oh, right, and this is called Schnitzel Company. I was lucky to do this temporary commission in the city of Vienna. I was actually commissioned by the kind of labor office of Vienna. They're responsible for, employment and unemployment insurance. I think it's called employment insurance now, right, in Canada? It used to be, or I'm dating myself now. I prefer unemployment insurance. I think it's just more, real than employment insurance. Is just, if you were employed, why would you need insurance, right? So I hate this, I hate, things like that. But sometimes I'm also a bit reactionary. I still prefer, what was it? What was before Canada Day? Dominion Day. I still prefer that, at least because that's the real politics. Dominion Day. I hate Canada Day. It sounds like LL Bean or something. It's just like too generic. So, anyways, I was asked to come up with something and on the subject of labor. And it was always, and I started looking, I was the seventh in the line of artists invited over 7 years. And I looked at it and it was like a perfect split. 3 artists had done something about labor as toil, and the other one was labor as heroic, And then I went, no, I don't want to deal with that. I want to do kind of like the employee of the month, right? So these are like the employees of the month for a fictitious company I invented called Schnitzel Company. But I also wanted to show how multi-ethnic it was. Because if you go to a place like Vienna, right, there's a kind of a right-wing demagogue that's just got elected there. But if you go to a place like Vienna and so on, they'd like to, you'd like to see this image of, pure as snow Austrians. But if you go especially into the, fast food outlets and so on, it's like every color under the rainbow is working there. It's quite amazing. Or go to a hotel, person clean your room, and so on. So I wanted to show, like, different ethnicities, right? As Austrians, right? So they'd be like that, right? Some people really hated this in Vienna. Right, and I like the idea that Takeo Baumholz was, maybe he was adopted. Takeo was probably adopted as a little kid, right? So I like these little stories. Like, so there'd be people going by going, "What? He does not look, Austrian," and so on. I wanted that kind of reaction as well, but kind of like very dryly expressed. And I also did this piece, which is a kind of recurring theme, and it has to do with death, actually. And it's called, this is the first iteration of this death series, and it's called 4 French Deaths in Western Canada. And what was weird was, I like to look at the obituary, and I think some other people also, I like looking at obituaries pretty well once a week, and I guess nobody else does that as a hobby, too morbid. I love looking at obituaries, right? Because I want to make sure that my name's not there, and so but anyways, so I happened to see in Vancouver like 2 one day looking at obituaries. I thought, wow, they're both born in France. It was kind of weird, right? And so then I started looking up at the archive of the Vancouver Sun in terms of obituaries of people who died in Western Canada but was born in France, and I found 2 more. Right? It took a while, but I found 2 more. So then I decided to make a piece called Four French Deaths in Western Canada, and they were done on board, wooden board, and screen printed, finally. And I showed this in Paris in this gallery, and one of the reporters from Le Monde came by, and he actually had a tear in his eye. And I said, "Oh, you like the work?" He goes, "Oh, it's not that. It's the idea that there are these French compatriots who died so far away in Western Canada." That's the God. Right now, oh, okay. So, right, Didier Pérouse, born in Gascogne, France, passed away suddenly on December 15, 2001 at the age of 58. Mr. Pérouse And I altered the names. I didn't use the same names, right? And I kind of, you know, spliced in other things, so I might say. So they're not basic. It's like it's partly composite, partly not, right? No, wait a second. Why is this one in? Oh, right. He moved to France in 1930s. Okay, that was the catch. I thought, oh man, I blew that. I never saw that. Right. He had no children. He moved to Canada in 1958. Worked as a handyman. He enjoyed fishing, gardening, and outdoor life. I was interested in the kind of banality of memorials as well, you know. And then at the end, Sergio, you are now at peace with God. Right. Forget, born in 1927 in Caen, in France, passed away peacefully after a short hospital stay, predeceased by her father Dominique and Arnaud, brother Arnaud, lovingly remembered by her many friends. She generously gave to herself to so many with great love and passion, and so on. And this was born in Ile de la Réunion, which is an island in the Indian Ocean, which is an outre-mer, if you know anything about France. So it is a department of France, right? It's considered French proper. And so they kind of look like this with the kind of parchment color. I showed these in Mississauga. And I also did public art pieces. I was commissioned by the Vancouver Art Gallery to do a piece on the millennium. And when I went to the curator of the art gallery, said, yeah, we think you'd be perfect to do a piece on the millennium. This is like 1998. And I said, thank you for the opportunity, but you want me to do a piece on the millennium? Like, what the hell is that supposed to mean? The millennium? Millennium's like 1,000 years, right? Yeah, I said, yeah, the millennium, right? And so I went, holy shit. I thought, that's pretty big, the millennium, you know? But then I happened to be in Hamburg like a month later, you know, Hamburg was is a great port city, as you know, of Germany. It was also the slave, you know, disembarkation site for Germany. It was like a lot of slaves African slaves were bartered through the port of Hamburg, and it's a maritime city. And so, like Liverpool, it has maritime insurance companies and so on. And on the friezes, you'd see these boats. And I looked up and I went, yeah, okay, arrival by boat along the parapet of the Vancouver Art Gallery. At the time, they wanted the commission to be on the grounds, and I said, no, it needs to go on the parapet, right? Because then it would be directional. And then everything kind of unfolded logically. Once I got that idea, it would start with a longboat, right? And then would proceed on to Captain Vancouver's HMC Discovery, and then it would be no, that's not the one. It would be the Black Boat, which is the, do you know? No? Komagata Maru, right? Which was berthed outside English Bay for 3 months in Vancouver, because it's really a story you should know. You know, it's a really important story because they were given title to disembark, right? At least in theory, because they were part of the Commonwealth. They bore the Indians from the Bengal, bore a British Commonwealth passport, right? And that was the idea of the Commonwealth, right? The only problem was for the rulers was that they never imagined that these people would actually have, you know, be actually moving physically to these places. So then they had to kind of reinvent and redefine passports given to non-whites in Commonwealth nations as not really a permit to come to any other part of the Commonwealth, except if you're white. And so it's a very, you know, it's like Galileo, right? The Catholic Church had to kind of reinvent, okay, we're imprisoning Galileo because we don't believe him, but maybe he's also right, and so now we have to negotiate, you know, the way the Earth actually maybe does turn a circle around the sun, and somehow fit it within Catholic doctrine, and so on. So same thing here with the And also, by the way, a kind of a denouement to the story is the massacre of the passengers of the Komagata Maru in the Bengal when they got back. They were actually massacred by soldiers there. I don't, so you should look this up. It's really too important to not know about. And then the yellow boat was, it's based on a kind of Fujian migrant ship, which really was not seaworthy at all. And this was in the, I can't remember the year now, 2000, mid-90s actually, or 93, 94. And maybe some of you remember they were kind of unceremoniously dumped on these shoals, freezing to death of Queen Charlotte Island, right? And the boat was like this rusting hulk. It was completely orange, right? It was really, I was amazed that the ship actually made it that far, and literally super overcrowded, and so on. And the picture of these would-be migrants from Fujian, China, was actually quite beautiful in a funny way because it was so pastoral. They were just kind of sitting there, seagulls are going over, and mollusk shells were encrusting these rocks, and so on. So I saw them as kind of directional markers, all right? You have to walk around the entire block in order to see it. And excuse me. And the work is called Four Boats Stranded. Red and yellow, black and white. We're all God's children in His sight. It's like based on the Civil War Christian song. And this is the work I did for Documenta. It's actually a mirror work. It's not very big. It's only about 400 square feet, actually less than 400 square feet. And it's called Mirror Maze with 12 Signs of Depression. And so you walk in, and it's kind of a funhouse mirror. But at many points, there's 12 inscriptions. Because the space is very small, the 12 inscriptions really kind of create a kind of visual cacophony. And so number 9 is, all I ever do is sleep. There's another one that says, I want to kill myself. I have no friends. I can't remember the other ones. But they all come from basic, almost like pop psychology. If you are experienced at the same time more than 6 of these 12 symptoms, go see a doctor. You're in trouble, and so on. And it was very interesting because people would walk into it and literally walk into it, and because castles in Germany, you had a lot of Europeans there, and they'd be reading it in English because it was a second language, and they might say, all I ever do is sleep. Okay, boom, right? You'd hear a bump. They'd hit their head against the mirror because they got lost in reading it, and so you heard this all the time from the outside, right? You couldn't hear them. You just hear this murmur from the outside, but you kept hearing boom, boom, right? And I knew, oh, that's another guy's head, right? And I was interested in this because, this is done, I feel alone in the world, number 4. So, and the reason why, this is like the site of the l'orangerie, right? The l'orangeries were, basically pavilions for oranges because the king can, right? We can go to Africa and we can bring back oranges and grow them in the wintertime under these greenhouses and so on. And it was, and they're often done on the principle of kind of radiating ponds and pools and walkways, and these radiating pathways would converge at the center point of the l'orangerie or the kind of imperial palace and so on, right? And of course, there's a real kind of enlightenment type of planning for a park. And so I saw that as a kind of leitmotif of how space is organized in these l'orangeries, and I wanted to kind of like bring it up to date and pathologize it. And then, I continued doing these kind of diptychs. They got more and more big, and they had text that kept repeating itself, and variations. And so, I like this kind of variation of repeated text The texts don't repeat themselves absolutely identically, but they repeat in variation. So they have a slightly mantric quality. And because it looks similar enough, you see a lot of text and you can actually assimilate the text quite quickly. And it creates a kind of circularity. And what I hoped would also produce a kind of sense of duration of you standing in front of the work, right? So, and I was having fun too. You can see the chalk lines here, right? So I'm actually directing that guy, so it's like a meta work. I'm directing both of them. There's chalk lines here too, you see? So I'm directing them and he's directing it. And he's trying to enact pain, which is painful to watch. So I saw everything as slightly in meta terms. And for the art historians, the expulsion from Eden, by Cranach. So don't be silly. You're not ugly. You're not ugly. You're not ugly at all. You're being silly. You're just being silly. You're not ugly at all. And no matter how much consoling she gives to this Asian woman, you also know it will never be enough, right? So, I like this kind of suspension in the picture, right? And it points to the drain as well. So. And I like this idea of, the possibility of reinvention. So this lady, as they say in French, une femme au troisième âge, right? That is a more elderly woman. She's learning French, right? And she's trying to learn French at her age, and it's very basic French. So je suis française, je suis américain, je suis anglaise, je suis canadienne, je suis, right? And so on. So, and what that means, right? To learn a language, not just learn a language, but learn a language at a later phase in life. And she kind of, as she's reading this basic French book, she pauses, right? She just pauses. That's all. And I see it as a kind of, it's ontological, totally ontological at that moment of recursive contemplation. So these are all stage. I actually met her in the UBC, University of British Columbia jacuzzi, and and I said, "You're perfect for this piece." I wanted to, and I bought these outfits. These jeans were too small actually, and there's actually, if you can't see it, but on the outside it's actually a big split right here, right, and so on. So we had to tie it invisibly, right, just for the picture. And and it's painful because she's basically saying, "I want you back. Even though you're shit, I want you back. I'd be too lonely." But you also have doubts of whether that guy will ever come back. And I was just kind of interested in this guy who was working in Chinese and a Canadian restaurant, let's say, and he's having a break, and obviously English is not his first language, but he knows the orders, and he's hearing orders all day in his head, maybe when he goes to bed. So it's like during his break, he's going cheeseburger, chicken chow mein, deluxe burger. So he's going a little bit mad. Bacon and eggs over easy. These sorts of things I think matter, I got an anecdote, maybe it's not entirely related, but I remember working at a smorgasbord. Do they still have smorgasbords today? Okay. But U of T students probably don't know, because you guys are too shishi for that, right? But I was working at a smorgasbord, and I remember there was a fight between two women. I was only doing it as a part-time job, because I was young. And two middle-aged women were fighting because one had to scoop up the mashed potatoes, and the other was scooping up broccoli or the beans or whatever. And they're having a fight. And I remember a friend of mine who's also we were in high school then, and a high school friend of mine said, "Oh man, look at that! That's hilarious. They're having a fight over who's scooping out the mashed potatoes and so on." And I remember thinking, yeah, it's funny. But then when I went to bed that night, I remember thinking, yeah, actually, it makes sense you fight over that, because if you've ever scooped mashed potatoes, it's a lot more work. It's hard, right? It was like I had this epiphany. I went to bed and I went, yeah, that's right. When you scoop, you have to go like that. But when you deal, it's just like that, right? And I went, wow, that's worth fighting over. And then I did these kinds of works, and I like this idea of like turnover in business, so that, but using the logic of monochromes and so on, so that the white is basically for lease, right? It's not occupied. And I kind of saw it also like these people are in the same boat, that's like the success of the mini mall, means success for everybody, right? So some residual idea of a community there. Like here, there's some demographic in terms of Vietnamese presence. Paris Bakery has pho soup and hong phuc and hong vuong. Sorry, I'm going to speed by. Is this really dragging on? I feel like I'm talking a long time. No? If I am, just yell out, boring. Okay. I'll try to speed up a little bit. This is done for the Istanbul Biennale. It's called House of Realization. Again, the continuation of mirrors. It's an installation with a poem by Yunus Emre. Yunus Emre is like I can't remember the century. It's something like 12th century or 13th century Sufi poet, today Turkish. And so wrote in Arabic, right? But I had it, but it's quite a famous Sufi poetry poem called House of Realization. And in this poem, it actually talks about how, the Asia Minor was represented this house of realization in which Christians, Jews, and Arabs and Muslims interacted. It was a very kind of utopian poem, and a very famous one. It's often recited in Turkey. And so for the Istanbul Biennale, I did this, and I built this corridor, had this corridor built, and it's very long, and it's quite narrow, and the entire text is in Turkish and English, and it's backwards, right? And it's so long that you basically have to walk from where the crowd is all the way down in order to properly read the text in its proper order by looking in the mirror, because the text is backwards, right? And then you kind of get to the end, and there's another corridor with a mirror facing you, and then you can see with the guy in profile, you have to go down another corridor, there's a mirror at that corridor, and then you end up in an antechamber, and you realize it's actually a two-way glass. You can actually see, but you don't actually know when you're at this point where this woman is and that man, you actually don't know that people are looking at you, right? But that man and this woman, if they continue, will end up in this position. So yes, there's a kind of disequilibrium in terms of the power of who gets to be perceived, but you end up in that position anyways, right? And of course, it was also kind of funny because people would put on their lipstick, people would pick their nose, whatever. They would do all kinds of things, but if they were caught unawares, they'd actually didn't know. And I remember there was the Jan Willem Schroefer, who was the director of the Rights Academy in Amsterdam. He was in Istanbul during the time, and he was in there all the time, right? And it was a very Dutch thing he was about to say. I said, wow, Jan Willem, you really like this piece. He goes, it's very rare in society to be able to really, really look at someone directly, right? And so he was in there like basically every day, So it's a long story on this one, but it's about home, done in Vienna, right? It was actually there were these kind of info screens which been going on for almost 20 years. Every year they invited an artist to design info screen. Each info screen was only basically this ratio here, right? And it was always pro forma. The city, you had to vet it through the city, and they stamped it. This one year, this was during the time of the rise of Jörg Haider, right, the ultra-right leader who passed away now, and they forbade it. It was the first time it was ever forbade. I was the 21st, and in 20 years, right? And so museum, the Kunsthalle was shocked. Why would it be forbidden? And you know, they gave a very smart political answer. They said, we don't feel that Mr. Lum's work is taking public dialogue in the right direction. That's what they said to me. And so, you know, I thought that was the end of the project, but then the League of Human Rights found out about it through the Kunsthalle, and they said, and the Kunsthalle said, you know what, we have the side of this building. Do something there. And so, and the only thing is I had to make 5 additional versions of this, obviously very big. And I actually have a story about this. I was actually interviewed because it was such a kind of controversy at the time. I was actually interviewed, and it was like live TV. It turned out not to be live. The guy basically BS'd me, but it was actually you know, one of the 2 state-run ORF stations. And I said, okay, do you want a warm-up? And the guy said, no, it's fine. I know the questions, right? And so he says, hi, blah, 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 in German, and then he writes, and then he translates it in English. And then he says, so my first question, Mr. Lum, he says, why did you decide to include yourself among the 6 people? And I turned around and I said, that guy? That's not, and I said, that's not me. And he says, cut. True story, right? And then I did Pi, also in Vienna. Vienna's been a good city for me. It's like this huge public art project called Pi, done underground in Vienna. If you've been to Vienna, there's an underground passageway which is very long, about 180 meters actually long in length, and joining, you know, St. Stefan and the Vienna Opera House with the Naschmarkt and also the Vienna Secession. So, you know, 2 very important precincts. It's kind of joined by this subterranean corridor. Why? Because, you know, during the post-war period, Vienna did suffer some damage in Second World War, and in their wisdom, they decided to put a freeway above ground. And so this is a very circulated underground passageway. And I started thinking about, well, what can you do in terms of the underground? And you were given certain spots, only certain spots that used to be for backlit advertising down the corridor. And I claimed this as well in order to tether the work together. And I started thinking of pi, you know, which is, you know, about arithmetic to determine, you know, basically the area of the circumference of the circle, as a kind of reference to the globe itself above ground, because it's you know, circular. And so these were like these sites where, and that was the problem with the difficulty of the project, because the project, you know, RFQ was, it must occupy these former spaces where we used to have backlit boxes, cannot intrude into the space, and so on. So some people kind of withdrew, but it was like €1 million. It was like a really big commission. And so here it's in Germany. It's a number of schnitzels eaten in Vienna since January 1. Every year it gets updated. This is actually a count-up clock, so it actually moves, and actually tries to move in approximate to real time. So at dinner time it actually goes quite fast, and so on. And the numbers are, you know, basically accurate, right? Because we have it's quite fun. At the end of the year, we actually have a group Skype conference with the, you know, the Federation of Pork Growers and Veal Growers, and then another one in terms of the Department of Psychology at the University of Vienna, and so on, because one's about depression. And this one is about, amount of spent worldwide since January 1 in euros on armaments. And this one, you can see it's a really big count of clocks. They're really expensive, these count of clocks. And it's just going like this constantly, really fast. And the slowest one is the one about Chernobyl. So you can sort of see how they're kind of staggered, right? So I didn't make these sites. These are sites that were given. There's like 20 sites or whatever, and they kind of stagger like this. And the entire corridor curves. And so you actually, at some point, and I didn't anticipate this, you see yourself approaching, you see yourself going away at the same time. HIV infection worldwide since January 1. So, some of it's more trivial than I did these kinds of paintings that deal with like infographics, so anger to forgiveness, the 12 stages of depression, right? The kind of gradients there, and then Monday to Friday, things like that. And then psychological pathways, the path from riches to poverty, the path from happiness to misery, the path, and sometimes the reverse. Keep going. And I think this is getting close to the end. And more recently, I've been working on these really. I showed some of these at the Rick Rhodes. That's not called Rick Rhodes Gallery. DuPont Projects, right? It's called DuPont Projects. I don't know why. Why don't you just call it Rick Rhodes Gallery? Right? But DuPont Projects. But these are much bigger. These are like. This is probably like 8.5, almost 9 feet high. Maybe it is 9 feet high. It's very big. And so, I kind of, they're kind of based on obituaries, but and also my imagination. And so I'll just read it to you. The Mystery of the Tattooed Lady, and it's written in this kind of frontispiece, 19th century frontispiece language. It takes a long time to write and get correctly. The Mystery of the Tattooed Lady, the most complete account of the mysterious death of Jade Fischer, probably Swiss, the mother of an elementary school child, ever presented to the public reader, with facts derived from the most authentic sources, including the coroner's toxicology tests, which have proved inconclusive as to cause of death, and investigators who have tried to trace her whereabouts before she died, or whether someone drove Jade to the site where her body was found in the late evening of Saturday or early morning of Sunday, because there's no evidence that she walked there herself, and who remained unidentified until several photos of her distinctive tattoos and a wedding band were released, which helped investigators identify her as married to a woman from Lancaster last May, according to her Facebook page. It's one sentence. And then this one, I'll just read quickly. A recounting of the events and experiences. It's like frontispieces were written and designed for you to buy the book, right? The picture album. Matthew Brady had these frontispieces for his books, for example. A recounting of the events and experiences in the life of Yassir Khurshid, with the means by which he acquired his courage and wisdom, whose influence in the field of garment factory reform was felt here and abroad, the inequity of sweatshop conditions, ! A chronicle of a good person's untiring fight to win garment workers' rights to sanitary working conditions, maternity and paid leave, a raise in the minimum wage, and a stop to the beating and sexual harassment of exploited laborers, including children for whom he fought hard for their protection, until the last day of his life at the age of 34, dying from cancer due to benzene exposure. So I incorporated some of my own mother's experience. And then this one, printed by particular desire for the benefit of all who are easily touched by the sincerest allurement that could tempt the human heart, a story of love such as thrived within Amrit Jasvinder Rajput, 19, for Hardeep Singh, her dream of leaving Faradok to be with Hardeep and become a beautician, rather than to wed her mother's cousin, to whom her family owed money. Her entire life's record, including her kidnapping, torture, and death by immolation in an honor killing carried out by her father, Bishopal, and brother, Rabi, with events of remarks that may not be deemed uninteresting to the public at large. Life as a key punch operator, or the exciting escapades of Charlotte Wilson Turner, the seventh of 10 children of George and Harriet Wilson, who upon graduating from Camden High School became a first-rate clerk typist for the Veterans Administration, comprising anecdotes of Willie Turner, the police officer husband to whom she was married 62 years, and with her death following exactly the one-year anniversary of her husband's death, giving a full account of all the larks, sprees, rows, rambles, and other frolics, including saving up and going on a Caribbean cruise, being a faithful portraiture of her joy in her daughter Josephine and Lucy, and her love of sewing, with particular observations of her attending the Camden School of Office Training to further herself as a key punch operator until her health failed, forcing retirement, but remaining active as an usher in the Antioch Camden Baptist Church. The most unfortunate case of Lucy Chona Santos, convicted of smuggling heroin into Indonesia, whose mistake was to fall victim to a phony employment recruiter who fronted for an international drug gang and later threatened to kill Lucy's family if she refused to do as the gang demanded. Follow her story from growing up in a shanty on the edge of Manila, where she supported her parents and siblings by retrieving value from garbage, to bearing a child at a tender age, of whom she was separated for several years as she sat on death row awaiting execution by firing squad, passing her days in a squalid and overcrowded prison. To this is offered the particularities of her finality, including the many press stories, legal and diplomatic documents, and the many affecting and heart-rending letters to her son written a short time prior to her demise, all pressed from the originals of her own handwriting. And these are the last works I'll show you. It's a series. Actually, they're all bronze now. And these are just a bunch of, because I moved to Philadelphia, and so Philadelphia is a really interesting city, but it's also a highly traumatic and traumatized city with a very complicated history. It's a great city. I love being in Philadelphia, and I'm kind of fascinated by it. And so this is of Birdie, Africa. They were part of the MOVE bombing over 30 years ago now, where the city of Philadelphia decided to firebomb the cult called the African Family, led by John Africa. You're going to have to look it up. And so this is a series called Tragic Philadelphians. This is Joey Stefano. They're all born in Philadelphia. Joey Stefano died at the age of 26 from HIV poisoning, but also complicated by speedball overdose. And he was known as kind of like the Cary Grant of the gay porn world, right? So he's very famous within the gay porn world. Jim Croce, who's singer, I Got a Name, those songs, operator and so on, from Philadelphia, and died in a plane crash just when his career was taking off. Tyrone Everett, welterweight champion of the world, very young, died at the age of 27 when he was caught in bed with a transvestite by his girlfriend, who shot him. Nancy Spungen, of Sid and Nancy, of the Sex Pistols, Sid Vicious, killed her. The great Billie Holiday, great singer, beautiful, fantastic singer. Her biography is very painful to recount. And I thought about Grace Kelly, but then I realized, yeah, she died, but she became a princess, and she grew up wealthy too, so didn't qualify. All right. So I don't know. I also want to just kind of briefly tell you about this show called Monument Lab. I'm curating. It's on right now in Philadelphia. Should I show the video and then just end it maybe? This is Tyree Guyton's piece, and anyways, this is Tanya Bruguera's piece. It was a huge production, and it's about the question of what we do with monuments, right? And people are going, oh, how were you so prescient? And I actually thought with my partner, Paul Farber, who we both curated this, we were co-curators, who's a prof in urban studies at Penn, and we thought we were late when we thought about this 4 years ago, right? So, but anyways, it's received a lot of press, including PBS NewsHour. We got 5 minutes. New Yorker magazine's coming out with a profile on the show, and so on. This is Mel Chin. And, oh yeah, and there's controversy because this is like the racist, homophobic mayor of Philadelphia, Frank Rizzo, and he stands in front of the Municipal Services Building, kind of doing a kind of Nazi salute towards City Hall, which is beautiful, right? And so they had to fence this off because people really want to take it down and so on. But we also had Hank Willis Thomas as a gigantic Afro pick, which is in proximity to the Rizzo, and now there's this kind of real dialogue about this, right? So see, I think these debates in terms of do you take it down, that's not the right question. I think the right question is, what can artists do with it before making a decision? And I'll just show you quickly the Monument Lab. Okay. Oh, right. Is sound on?
Monument Lab is a public art and history project based in Philadelphia this fall with mural arts. We are building temporary monuments with artists in public squares and parks. We are also collecting creative proposals with your ideas. This is how it works. Here's a blank proposal form. You can find it at one of the 10 labs around the city. There's a space to name your monument and to describe or sketch your idea. People have come up with many new ways to represent the histories that are meaningful to them, especially around issues of social justice and solidarity. On the form, you can add where you could imagine your monument in the city and share your age, zip code, and social handles for credit if you'd like. Then, within minutes, our lab team scans and sends your idea into a data system where it is transcribed and mapped, just like any piece of civic data or city statistic. It then goes live on our website and is shown in a museum at our exhibition hub in the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. Later, it becomes an open data set and is shared in a final report to the city next year. Why are we doing this? We want to unearth future monuments, to try out some new ways to make monuments, and we want to learn how to change the ways we write the history of our city together. Join us this fall for a full map of places you can see or propose monuments, and for up-to-date info, visit us at monumentlab.muralarts.org.
So, thanks a lot. I'm open to questions.
Thanks, Ken, so much for giving a wonderful talk. I would like to open the floor to questions. Where? You? Okay, great.
Oops, sorry, I gotta turn first.
Thank you. Thanks for this detailed talk. Some years ago, I attended your talk at UT Mississauga, I believe, and I still remember the word you used, the emphasis on the quotidian, everyday life. So the question is, it's not about what you have shown us. I appreciate that. Though you're from Vancouver and you've been abroad, but you did leave your mark in Toronto, because in the old Chinatown, Toronto, you made public street sculptures. I'd like you to elaborate on that. I find it very evocative, very whimsical. Yeah, it's about innocence.
Yeah, I had to make a selection in terms of the talk due to time, right? But yeah, I have a public art piece in a very kind of interstitial space.
Yes, and I want to show Ho Tam that too. He's in town.
Okay, and it's off Bay and just south of Dundas, and it's a kind of a walkway, very nondescript walkway that's next to the Toronto Hydro station or something. And right next to it, I think there's an Aroma Coffee there, right? It's a kind of nondescript condo building. And so that walkway, I found out was, there was an old synagogue within, 100 feet there. It was also the first Chinatown was basically there. So I had two figures that I sculpted of children, one, and they were not of the same time, right? So it's not synchronic except in their presence, right? They're diachronic, and so one is, wearing almost like a babushka scarf. A girl is about 10 and whatever, faintly Eastern European, and she's sitting on a plinth, and then the boy is got 19th century Chinese garb. He's sitting on a plinth, and they look at each other, and the whole engagement is that you walk parallel to these two plinths of children looking at each other, and across space and time. And so there's in pin letterings in bronze in between it says, across space and time, two children of Toronto meet. Right, but you look it up. That's yeah. Okay. No, I meant to the other class. Yeah, and go back there. Yeah, let's see it again. Yeah.
Hi. Thanks, Ken. That was a really comprehensive and good overview of the work. I was interested in hearing your thoughts on the difference between your work presented in place, so public space versus institutional space or biennial space, because they all have different kind of political and conceptual shapings, and I think it really changes the way your work's read, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, public space demands your recognition that most people are not interested in art or know anything about art. I think that you have to acknowledge that, right? You can't go in there and be arrogant and say, well, if they don't, they're just a bunch of dilettantes or, or worse. And so that's the first thing. All my museum work always had I would say, a kind of public character to it, so it lends itself to a kind of public address in a way, right? Or at least it tried to take you on a trajectory to real things outside the gallery system. And that's not to demean or belittle the gallery system. I like gallery. In fact, right now I'm so sick of doing stuff outside, I want to go back to the galleries, right? So that's what I'm doing. I've got shows lined up this coming year in galleries now, right? Because that's what I want to do now, right? And I don't want to write anymore. I'm sick of writing too, to be honest. And so, so you have to understand these. Oh, I didn't show the work I did for the Whitney Biennial. Oh well. And so, the ideas come from the street, right? But if you and the advantage of the gallery is that you can, we learned this from Duchamp and so on, that you bring something, transport it back into the gallery space, and it's framed as art, and it has this kind of frisson because it looks like non-art. At least I try to instill some degree of non-art, not for the sake of non-art, because they're definitely art, but for the sake of maybe deferring the immediate recognition as art, because the moment of non-recognition, that moment is really about something real that's out there, I feel, and that's what I'm interested in, right? And so if you do something in terms of public art, first of all, it's really hard because there are so many, there's just so many stakeholders, right? Bureaucratic stakeholders, political stakeholders, and you have to kind of negotiate all that. And sometimes it's just not worth it, right? I mean, I hardly ever do anything for private development because, not that I'm not entirely interested, but because, you sit there and every time, almost totally, the developer or the agent for the developer will be sitting there, and of course it's not supposed to be a voter, but it's going to influence everything, right? And so it's just not worth it at some point, right? But I also was interested in trying my hand in terms of art in public because it freed me from the tyranny of museum and gallery spaces too. So, I'm a kind of very taciturn person, as you can probably tell. And so I'm never happy in one spot, just like I'm never happy in academia, right? Which is, I don't think many people quit 2 tenured jobs ever. I quit twice, full professorship once, right? So, and I quit, right, because I just couldn't handle it, right? And it's terrible. I've worked at Penn 5 years, the best job in terms of academia I've ever been associated with, and I'm already thinking, oh God, I need to maybe leave. So it's terrible. But my wife would say, you better not. so that's the only way I can answer it.
For us to understand local history, can you expand on the reception of the photo portraits in the mid-'80s when they were shown at the Odessa Gallery here?
At the what?
At the Odessa Gallery.
Yeah, I showed some of those.
Yeah, can you expand on the reception and the nature of how...
It was, as I tried to convey, it was kind of negative, right? But, you know, people were curious about it. They were kind of attracted to it, but they were also didn't feel good about being attracted. That was my sense.
Was that distinct to Toronto or across the country?
It was probably across the country because I had some, right, but probably more so then. I think in Toronto it was much more, I don't know, I have this theory, because I wrote this essay for Canadian art called Canadian Cultural Policy. It's like this history. It goes right up until probably 1990s, and so on. And people say, you know, you should write the essay for what happened since 1990. It's really interesting, and you know a lot about it. And I said, why don't you write it? Right, because it's a lot of work, right? I wasn't trying to be rude. I'm just saying someone else should write it, and so, and I think there was this kind of burden, perhaps, especially in upper. Is this upper or lower Canada? This is upper Canada, right? I can't remember anymore. You're upper Canada, right? Yeah. See what happens when you go into the melting pot? You start forgetting, right? And so, and that you know, that was very strong at one time. That there was a way to define Canadian art and the Canadian project of culture, right? And it was centered here, I would say, right? At least that's the way I internalized it, right? And I kind of internalized it another way. I remember the first time I drove across Canada, and you know, you see the grain elevators in Saskatchewan, all this sort of stuff. But it wasn't until I came across Lake Superior and Group of Seven territory, I went, oh my God, I'm in Canada, right? It was like this realization, like, wow, I'm finally in Canada, right? I know I have a Canadian passport, but I wasn't in Canada until I rounded Wawa, right? And it was like this moment, well, whoa, you know, and so on. I think there was this at that one time, and that's not to devalue the idea that, you know, Canadians shouldn't define Canada by its own indigenous criteria of art. I'm not suggesting that, but there was this insecurity, let's say, in terms of, you know, this kind of hegemonic art system further south and so on. And they saw me as this. Some artists actually, quite frankly, I went into the Cameron Bar one time, and a guy was actually quite rude to me. It was a painter, unnamed, and sat down, and he said, you know, and I don't know where it came from, to be honest, since I didn't really know him. And he said, you know, just because you know, you're doing well in Germany and so on doesn't mean you paid your dues here. Right? This is how, you know, it was just purely this thing that, right? And I just sat down, and okay, you know. So that was my experience at that time. Someone here.
Hi, so I'm really interested in the stories that you told where you made art in response to a colleague making some kind of comment where you noticed this disjuncture between your experience and theirs. And I know you describe your work as ambivalent to identity politics, so I'm curious how you respond when people accuse you of making work that's associated with identity politics. How do you approach making art as an Asian Canadian artist that does touch upon these social issues?
Well, actually, no one's ever accused me of making work that was about identity politics. No one, ever, right? In fact, I was accused of being an Asian artist, not making work about identity politics. That's more true, right? I mean, there was a rally in front of the Vancouver Art Gallery one time demanding that, you know, a certain percentage of the programming each year be given over to artists of color and so on. I mean, I think that's a legitimate debate. I'm not discounting that. And then, unfortunately, and I went to the rally, I thought in a kind of support, right? And then, unfortunately, the curator said, you know, we've had shows by, you know, Ken Lum and Stan Douglas, who's, you know, African Canadian, and you know, the person who was the spokesperson, who had a mic, says, or megaphone, says, yeah, they're not artists of color anymore. I'm honest to God, right? And I'm standing there going, what the fuck? You know, it was just, you know, it's really, you know, I can't kind of qualify that any further, right? It was because, but also that I never made things where politics was identified exclusively as identity. I think that's really a very narrow way of working. Right? I'm not interested in politics purely as identity. I'm interested, I mean, if you want to talk about identity, I'm interested in this kind of Spivak notion from the early 80s, which he called strategic essentialisms, where you have to even exaggerate a kind of consensus of essence in order to, rectify and address certain deficiencies in terms of equity. I'm interested in strategies like that. But I'm not interested in the kind of reduction of politics to, I went to a talk recently by these people from New Orleans, and I liked them, right? Who did paper monuments. They are kind of stealing our idea of Monument Lab. And I don't know if you've been following what happened in New Orleans, where they removed the Confederate, Beauregard and Robert E. Lee, these statues, and the plinths are still there, right? And they removed 3 of them in the middle of the night, right? And the person from Paper Monuments said, someone said, oh, the mayor is fantastic, gave a beautiful speech. I don't know if you've read that speech. It's really an amazing speech, right? And she goes, yeah, he's such a wuss. And someone said, what do you mean, right? And he said, well, he actually removed the statue in the middle of the night, so we couldn't participate in celebrating the, and I'm going, wow, maybe there was like real politics involved, if you removed it during the day, right? I didn't dare say it because she would just, slam me, and I want to live, right? And so on, so I've never been accused of making identity politics. I've been accused maybe of not making it assertive enough or something, especially because I'm of my yellow skin.
Do we have more questions? Okay. So after this, we'll probably take one more and then put it.
This is just a kind of, it's not a very intellectual question, I'm sorry, but you mentioned that you're sort of tired of writing, but when you regain an interest in writing, would you consider writing kind of a warts and all take on your life as an artist and the Canadian art system and the experiences you've had? Is that something that you're sort of thinking about doing, or would you do it?
Well, I have to write a chapter about myself fortuitously, because Concordia University Press is publishing a book of all my writings, which will be about, I didn't realize, over 300 pages of writing, right? Including some essays which were juried, academic juried texts. They vary. I was never smart enough to be like an art writer who tried to write a kind of manifesto or write a kind of treatise that promoted my position, let's say, in the art system, because I was always, like I said, taciturn, so I've never, so I was never smart enough to try to position myself because I just couldn't do it. And so, I've written an essay on multiple identities on the Raft of Medusa, which I presented at Yale University, a conference, right? And there's a story there when I presented a paper, which was very well received, and at our history conference, and people said, "Oh, so where did you do your PhD?" And I said, "I don't have." So you're working on your PhD? I said, "No, I just have an MFA," and people are going, it's like, how did you get here? It was really bizarre, right? So each of these silos have this. So I have a book of all kinds of writings, just based on things I'm interested in, and that will be compiled and it's supposed to come out next year. But I have to write an essay about myself somehow. So please buy it.
Do I have more questions?
Question here.
Oh, Amy.
Hi. I was wondering if you could speak a bit about your proposal for the Victims of Communism Memorial.
All right.
I found what you said about the real estate piece really interesting in terms of, the history of that context of Asian people coming. And so as a Chinese person, like your relation to that and, what the piece was.
Yeah, there's as you know, there's already a winner for it in terms of a competition in Ottawa called Monument to the Victims of Communism, which, you know, I was not interested in. At least the first go around with it. And second of all, and then I saw it again. I was solicited, and I went, it's not something I'm interested in, right? Because it's like you can't win, right? And it's going to be so politicized and so on. And then, I don't know, I had this idea, right? And I'm an artist, so it's like I was driven more by the idea. And the proposal was of Vladimir Lenin being toppled but not falling. So the statue would be of a toppling Lenin, perpetually toppling, and so on. And you know, and there'd be you know. Anyways, I gave a talk about it and stuff, right? And it came in. They had a kind of poll, like thousands of people voted, and it came almost number one in terms of popularity by popular polls. Like I got well over 4,000 votes, and the next one up was like 4,100. It was like not much separating two. And the least popular one won. Not kidding. It's really abstract, right? It's really abstract, right? And then they gave us reasons why, you know, what the jurors said, including 2 jurors who were part of the sponsors. You know, the whole thing is a little bit dubious, I think, in hindsight. And the reason, and the number one reason for mine, you cannot represent Lenin, which I thought was appalling, to be honest, because it's like you're reproducing the authoritarian constraints of, you know, you cannot, right? That was number one. You cannot represent Lenin. I thought, why not? Why can't you represent Lenin? Right? And so on. So I forget what number 2 was. It was similar to that. You cannot. It was like, verboten, right? And so, but I knew that. I knew it was going to be a bit of an issue, right? Because the sponsors are, you know, Polish Americans, Ukrainian, Polish Canadian. See, I've been in Philadelphia 5 years. Polish and Ukrainian Canadian, and they're a bit of a grandstanders, and during the whole presentation, they were the ones that kept going. And you know, if you've been to these public art processes, you know a moment where I'm not going to win this, you know, and they were saying this. How can you present Lenin? As if I never thought about it. You know, as if, yeah, you're right. Shit. So.
I think that's all the questions. I mean, that's the Q&A. And thank you so much, Ken, for
Department of
giving
Fine
this
Arts is
lecture.
inviting everybody to Yutaka Sushi Restaurant. No, just kidding.
Thank you for coming out to the lecture tonight. I would like to invite you all to visit our museum for the current and upcoming exhibitions and events. Thank you so much. Have a good night.